Greetings everyone, it is Zakes here and I am back with our weekly videos. Hope you've been keeping warm in these, pretty cold months that we're having in South Africa, and I hope that you have a nice time enjoying our video and general content on the channel, right? Today we'll be talking about, public-private partnerships. I think this is pretty topical depending on when you'll be watching this, but we have been seeing at least the biggest economy in the world and the leader of the biggest economy in the world, in President Donald Trump, having a public disagreement, especially about policy too, which is something that you usually don't see, right? But a public disagreement with one of his advisors, right, in Mr. Elon Musk, who headed actually a certain, I would like to say, I don't want to say department, but a service, let us call it that, a service for the US government, right, in running Department of Government Efficiency, and the whole point was to save money and make the state more lean, something that I'll forever support irrespective of what I may think of the person behind it, right? Like the idea of cutting down government debt and government excess is something that I don't think any rational person would be opposed to. But due to the public spat that really centers around, Mr. Elon Musk's reliance on state contracts, according to Mr. Donald Trump, or the general idea, right, that the private sector ought to or should be involved intimately, as it currently is all across the world, right, with the state and getting things like taxpayer funding for private enterprises. So we'll be talking about that today under the general term of public-private partnerships. And firstly, let's start by defining them. I think from the example we are able to see what these are, right? But like at the rudimentary level, these are a partnership, as the name implies, between the state and the private sector for the fulfillment of a particular project, particular program, or a deliverable. This general definition that I have is meant to include even things that a lot of people would be like, oh no, but the state cannot function without contracting this out. And this would be what in South Africa we call the normal tender system, right? The idea that the state will have functions that it's supposed to complete, and due to incapacity on its part, it will then contract out those functions to the private sector. This is really at the basic level what a public-private partnership is. Now, of course, it has varying levels or varying dimensions, right? I would like to, the most typical example of a public-private partnership would be the example we spoke about between President Donald Trump and Elon Musk, right? The United States federal government gives the money that they get from US taxpayers to, SpaceX as an example, so that SpaceX develops rockets because NASA is not currently doing that, and SpaceX has been shown in some degree to be doing it at a much more efficient rate. That would be the reasoning behind it. But at a rudimentary level, for purposes of factually explaining what a public-private partnership is, that would be one dimension of it, right? An example of a public-private partnership. The United States government gets to contribute the money that it has towards the development of space exploration or rocket propulsion or whatever really the business model for SpaceX would end up being at, for it to be profitable. But the US government can still be involved in the development of technologies like that without necessarily, for instance, expanding NASA, right, which would be necessitated if NASA was doing what SpaceX is currently doing. So that is one level of public-private partnerships whereby the US government is not directly involved at an operational level with the building of these rockets, but it is involved at a financial level. And then in South Africa, we have another dimension of public-private partnerships, right? This dimension being the private sector actually is also involved in contributing financially to the establishment of a particular program or project. The most glaring example of this would be independent power producers, right? In South Africa, the government is not responsible for funding the establishment of independent power producers or the operations thereof at whatever power station the IPP would have. Instead, the business model of independent power producers legislatively is contingent on the fact that those various sources of energy in IPPs will then deliver their energy to the national grid, right? The whole reasoning behind that being that the state will get to enjoy more energy from independent power producers without the financial obligations and just the sheer need of resources that would be needed, right, to have an increase in energy supply from building new power stations and things like that. I mean, we're still dealing with the ramifications of one of the biggest power stations, I think, in the world, in Kusile, right, and how it is, even to this day, still operating under, I would say, questionable conditions. But, the government does not need to build another Kusile for it to have an increase in the supply of energy, because it can just outsource that to independent power producers who are required by law to sell it back to them. That is another form of, public-private partnerships, not in the form of giving money to a private company, as the example about the US was made, but in the form of actually having a business model that is contingent on state or monopolistic protection, right, on state legislative protection. I say monopolistic protection because, only the state creates monopolies, but that is a topic for another day. So those are what public-private partnerships are, right? The reasoning behind them, I think, for most people is that on the side of liberty, on the side of people who are for economic freedom and free enterprise, would be the state is inefficient. We know this. We argue this all the time. It is shown, really, just with the example of the Kusile power station that I just made right now in South Africa, right? The state is inefficient, and as such, why don't you want to have the private sector involved in whatever capacity it can be involved in the operations of the state? Because we know the private sector is driven by the profit motive, right? It is driven by the profit incentive, and as such, it then has different incentives than, for instance, anything that the state run, because there's no profit motive, and as such, there is no motivation for them to be better, for them to be efficient, and things like that, right? And that is, one would say, a reasonable argument. Of course, the counter to that is, why is the state even involved in doing so many things that it needs to contract them out to private service providers? The position I take within the libertarian context and the general free market context is that if something can be done by the private sector when it is contracted to do it by the state, then it means that something can be done by the private sector without it being contracted to do it by the state. Meaning that we do not need public-private partnerships, because the mere intrusion of the private sector means that the state is admitting that it is venturing in a field that is definitely not well adept at venturing into. And as such, I find like we are helping the state be more authoritarian, be more big, when we encourage the proliferation of public-private partnerships. And then someone on the other side would be like, but if we don't have public-private partnerships, we just have public programs, right, without the involvement of the private sector, because the ideal that I would have as a free market proponent would be the state not have any public programs, or at least limit them a great deal, and someone would be like, that is not happening. So if something is happening, don't you want it to happen as efficiently as is possible? And that is the argument for public-private partnerships, right? From, the libertarian / free market side. Of course, on the other side of people who are statists, really, it is another state program. Actually, some might be opposed to including the private sector in something like that, and part of the opposition is that it creates a formalized patronage system in whatever jurisdiction that it is implemented in. Using the American example, I think in America, maybe the Americans had not been publicly consciously aware of the inherent patronage system that really arises due to the fact that the state awards contracts, as an example, or the state is involved in like some business venture that requires it to award a contract or award some form of funding to a particular business person, right? They are seeing it right now in the instance of this close relationship between, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, right? Even though Elon Musk contracts were not awarded by Donald Trump initially, they were awarded by a different president. But Americans are seeing how close the relationship between big business and politicians can be pretty ruinous, in the sense of having your tax money going to fund, a business of someone who you may disagree with, and if you don't disagree with it, right? Having your tax money used to go fund a business like space exploration, when, for instance, an American voter think they're better better ways to spend their tax money. One of the best ways, of course, is just not taking the tax money itself. That is my ultimate solution. But one of the biggest drawbacks, particularly I would like to think for a country like South Africa, right, since we have just spoken about the US, is that public-private partnerships create, they formalize patronage networks. We are currently dealing with the problem of having these, pretty large patronage networks that seemingly encourage a non-deliverance of services, right? Because there are no consequences. The whole hedge of having the private sector being involved in this is that the private sector is driven by a profit motive. But if there is no competitive bidding process, if the awarding of these public-private partnership contracts is premised on personal relationships and patronage, which I think personally cannot be eliminated from any human relationship, right? One would just deal with people they are more comfortable with, they know, and instead of trying to ensure that we find saints somewhere who will be awarding public contract, let us just have the state stop doing a lot of the things that it's currently doing. That is just me, though. But the problems with public-private partnerships is that then, given this, what I think is an inherent natural human desire to want to see people people you associate with, benefit from whatever position of power you may have, right? This is something we see all across the world, as we just made an example with the United States, is that by having public-private partnerships, we say this is okay. This should be formalized. This is the way that things should be done. And as a proponent of free market, of free enterprise and free markets, I do not want that to be something, I openly support. I do not want to openly support the state doing more things and the state inherently picking winners and losers in whatever things that it is doing, which will always devolve to why not the other person, why not the other person, because it wasn't a market, right? Why use my taxes to benefit this one person and not me and not the other person? And those conversations, those questions, valid as they may be, can be avoided entirely if we just embrace liberty and let people solve their own problems by themselves without the states getting involved in any way whatsoever beyond the protection of life, liberty, and property. But that is the libertarian perspective on public-private partnerships. I may have, been all over the place in this video, but this is something that I am pretty passionate about. I hope I was able to communicate my passion with you, and I hope I inspired at least enough passion in you to want to engage with what I just said. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Please let me know. I am genuinely interested, always interested in reading your thoughts, good and bad, depending on the day and the video. Really, I really do find them pretty insightful, and I always try to learn from whatever engagement we have. So please do leave your thoughts down below. Give the video a like, subscribe if you're unsubscribed, watch other videos that we have on the channel, and always remember, stay free.